right, continuing on with the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab Outstanding Guest Speaker Series, today we are pleased to present Micah Connor and Frances O'Neill. Micah and Frances both work at the Furlong Library at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, formerly known as the Maryland Historical Society. Today, they will give a presentation on the resources held there. Their library collection exceeds 7 million items that addresses more than 5 centuries of history. Materials include books, journals, manuscripts, photographs, oral histories, and other archival materials. Some of its resources can be accessed virtually. The library offers a large collection of genealogical resources. Born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, Micah Connor enjoys working with libraries and archives. He joined the Maryland Center for History and Culture as an intern in 2014, processing special collections materials. He coupled this experience with work at the Special Collections and Archives at the Blucher College, where he graduated with a BA in history. He joined MCHC staff in 2018 and primarily supports library patrons with their research. He specializes in Revolutionary War research and loves helping people discover their ancestors. Micah is a former Hansard Scholar who studied at the London School of Economics and worked for a member of the UK Parliament. Frances P. O'Neill is a native of Hillsborough County, New Hampshire. He came to the Baltimore, Washington area in 1971 to attend Catholic University of America, where he earned both undergraduate and graduate degrees in history and an MS in library science. He began working at what today is the Maryland Center for the History and Culture in 1980 and has been a senior reference librarian since 1985. He has published a number of reference books on Baltimore history and is still at work on others at the present time. So I'd like to offer a warm virtual welcome to both Micah and Frances.
Thank you. Thank you. We greatly appreciate that. And it's truly an honor to speak before everyone at Truckee Meadows. And hopefully by the time we've finished with our presentation, you've picked up some new information on not just Maryland history, but also resources that you can use in conducting your genealogical research at our library, should you ever visit us in person or virtually. Again, this is Mr. O'Neill and I. Mr. O'Neill is our senior reference librarian and our organization's longest tenured employee. He just celebrated 44 years here in July, if I'm not mistaken. I've just celebrated 10, both as an intern and employee in June. And here is the breakdown of what we'll discuss in the time that we have allotted. We'll go over a brief history of our organization. That will be Mr. O'Neill's portion, along with our main reading room resources. He oversees those. Then we'll turn over to special collections resources. I'll talk to the group about that, as well as our online resources. And then finally, planning your visit, should you ever like to visit us in person.
Okay. So, like a lot of historical and genealogical societies on the East Coast, we originally started out as a private organization. We were founded in 1844 by a group of wealthy Baltimoreans, of whom there were a lot in 1844, because Baltimore in those days was the 4th largest city in the United States, right after New York, Philadelphia, and Boston came us. And so a lot of people here had made a lot of money, especially in the shipping industry. What a lot of people don't realize is that Baltimore is the Atlantic port that's the furthest west in the United States. So if you want to get your ship from Europe as far west as you can in the United States, you would land in Baltimore. You know, New York, Boston, all those places are further east. You have to travel further to get your products to the Middle West or the West. You know, but Baltimore gives you an advantage. So we were doing pretty well in the 1840s when we were founded. We also had the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which was one of the first railroads to make it as far as the Mississippi River. Really, our only competitors at that point were the Pennsylvania Railroad and eventually the New York Central Railroad. But when it came to getting your goods or people to St. Louis and Chicago, Baltimore was one of the big places to go through. So, you know, and meanwhile, they were bringing back wheat and coal from, you know, Appalachia and the Middle West and sending those things to Europe. So they were doing pretty well. They were inspired by the fact that the other three cities that were larger than them had already founded historical societies. And so we had to have one too. And so they founded it in 1844. And like a lot of them in those days, it was primarily aimed at glorifying their ancestors who had been in the American Revolution and had made the United States possible. So when it started out, it was a fairly homogeneous group of people who had ancestors who had been Revolutionary War soldiers and were wealthy enough to have money to invest in a library and a book collection to put in the library. So we've been collecting books since 1844. We've always been somewhat interested in genealogy, but initially it was, as I say, a private library. And so you would subscribe to be a member of the library. You would be able to borrow books, novels, history books, natural history books, whatever you wanted, because there were no public libraries in those days. The only way that you could use a library was to come to a private organization like us. Over the years, they founded public libraries in Maryland and in Baltimore in particular. You may have heard of the Enoch Pratt Free Library, which was one of the first public libraries in the United States. And so we were able to evolve from being a lending library, which is the way we started out, to becoming a more scholarly library, which is what we are now. We have a lot of collections, which Micah is going to be talking about, of people's family papers and that kind of thing, mostly from those large families who were involved in the American Revolution, which makes us a good place to come if you have Maryland ancestors who were soldiers in the American Revolution, because we have a lot of, if not all, the records of Revolutionary War soldiers from Maryland. But we have gradually come to specialize in local history here in the Baltimore, Washington area, and in family history, which is, covers the entire United States, because so many people went out from Maryland to other parts of the United States. The soil would get exhausted here. And so, 4,000 or 5,000 people from Southern Maryland would all go out to Kentucky, but they would keep their roots with Maryland for a couple of generations. And, then they would move on across the Mississippi and that kind of thing. So now people with Maryland ancestors are all over the United States, and in fact, all over the world, we get inquiries from. And we do our best to satisfy them in terms of, the information that we have and the information that we can help them find.
Okay. As it stands now, like Mr. O'Neill said, our big aim is genealogical research. That's our #1 research topic here, and a frequent one at that, followed very closely by what we call house building and neighborhood research. That's our statistically #2 research topic. That's our #2 research topic here in our library. And those two topics sort of marry and interplay with each other. And those are topics that we have really geared a lot of our resources towards. And that includes our main reading room resources. Again, Mr. O'Neill is our senior reference librarian. He oversees the main reading room and its resources, and he'll discuss those as we move on.
Yeah. So we have, as Micah said, about 7 million items in the collection. When it comes to books, which is what I am in charge of, we have probably about 80,000 that we've collected since 1844. We used to do a lot of exchanges with other historical societies. So we have a lot of journals still that, they have gotten rid of the original copies in most cases, digitizing them and that kind of thing. But it's a lot easier to use the originals, obviously, if you have the space for it. And luckily, so far, we do. Now, over the years, up until the Second World War, we were as I say, private organization. We're still a private organization. But up until then, you had to be elected to become a member of the society. And, you know, people got blackballed and all that kind of stuff where they didn't want them in and that sort of thing. But, you know, so we would have a lot of people who were retired or wealthy enough not to ever have to work, who would come in and volunteer for us, who would put together the different resources that we are so grateful to have now. And one of those is the Dealman-Hayward file, which is named after two gentlemen, Mr. Dealman and Mr. Hayward, who compiled it. It is information that they gathered from early newspapers. The first newspaper in Maryland was only printed in 1771. We can't compete with New England or even the other middle Atlantic states in terms of early newspapers. But as I say, we were a major city then, much more major than we are now. You know, you would think of us, if you think of the status that Atlanta or Houston has in the United States right now, that's where Baltimore was in the 1840s and the 1850s in the American mind. So there's an awful lot of information in there, not only on Marylanders, but on people from other places who got into the Maryland newspapers. And, you know, they preserved the genealogical information on them. We had volunteers working on that up to about the 1990s. They would go through the newspapers every day and clip or copy materials relating to, you know, births, deaths, and marriages of Marylanders and put them into the file. So we have them all in alphabetical order up to there. We still put in new things that we go back retrospectively and find. But, you know, it is a fantastic resource that we use every day. The other thing that we have in terms of, that's a 3x5 cards, and you can see, I think, the drawers on your screen of the Dealman file. Another one that we have is our historic buildings research, and there's a lot of genealogical material attached to that too. That's me pointing to it. Mike is the good one in this presentation, good looking one in this presentation. But, you know, we put down the names of the owners of the buildings, or, you know, when the churches were founded, when they went out of business, who they merged with, all that sort of thing. So if you have references to your ancestors, you know, worshiping at a certain place in Maryland, we can usually help you find out where the records are today, if they are anywhere, because a lot of church records, as you probably know, get lost or destroyed over the years, and which is too bad, because Maryland didn't record vital records through the state government until 1876 at the earliest, and that was just Baltimore City. And then most of the state only starts in 1898. So if you go to the Maryland State Archives to look for vital records, which you should do, they're down in Annapolis and they're a state agency. You know, they will tell you that they don't have much of anything from before the last part of the 19th century. If you're doing Maryland research from, you know, 1875 back, you're going to be dealing with churches. We have some church records here, and we know where a lot of others are, you know, which is an advantage to someone who has not done a lot of Maryland research, but they know that their ancestor was a Presbyterian who lived in Cecil County or something like that. We can give them an idea of which Presbyterian churches there were and where those Presbyterian records should be. There's no guarantee that they actually are, because a lot of things happen, bad things happen to church records. But, you know, we have a general sense, especially me after all these years, of, you know, what exists and where it is. You know, and that comes out of a lot of times the historic buildings research that we have. Now, other than that, I mean, we for many years, 100 years anyway, you know, clipped newspapers before newspapers were digitized. We would have newspaper clippings, you know, on people, places, things in Maryland. And, you know, in many cases, we're the only source of information on a given person or a place or a thing, you know, so it's always a good idea to talk to us. We may not be able to answer all of your questions, but again, we have a lot of experience, and so we can usually recommend somewhere else for you to talk to if we can't answer your questions ourselves. We have oodles of microfilm, more than most places do nowadays, because we're too poor to get most of our stuff scanned. So, but there's an advantage to having stuff on microfilm, which you don't always hear. You can search for things which the computer doesn't find. And believe me, there's a lot of stuff in local newspapers that the computer, even if the newspaper has been digitized, won't find for you because of the way it's laid out on the page. You're looking for John Smith, and it's laid out on the page as Smith, blah, 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 John, the computer doesn't register that as one term, when it says Smith died at his home on 17 East Utah Place on Tuesday, John, it won't find it for you, but a lot of times we can. So it's always worthwhile looking for them. Some of the publications that I have done are indexes to the Baltimore Sun, which is our newspaper of record here in Baltimore. It goes back to 1837, but there is stuff in the Dealman file that goes back all the way to 1771. It just isn't the Baltimore Sun. The Baltimore Sun is online, but as I say, it starts only in 1837. The search engines are not always as good as one would like them to be. So it pays to give us a call or send us an email, if you are stymied on finding something in Maryland. We are one of the best places to come. The Maryland State Archives has a lot of material that we don't, because they can have legal materials, stuff that was generated by local government and state government and that kind of thing. We are not legally allowed to have that. I understand things are different out west, where most of the time the State Historical Society and the State Archives are basically the same thing in a lot of states. But here in the East, it's usually a pretty strict dichotomy. We have things that are generated by private citizens, and they don't. And they have things that are generated by government agencies, and we don't. So you want to keep that in mind when you're doing research in Maryland.
Filing case A.
Oh, filing case A. Materials that people have donated to us over the years that they haven't gotten around to publishing, or it's too insubstantial to publish. It's just, one page of Bible records or something like that. They would send in to us in the days before you could scan all of this stuff and put it online. So we have a lot of stuff in what we call filing case A, which is all divided up according to families. So I was just talking to somebody on the telephone right now about the Sudler family from the Eastern Shore. She has a lot of photocopies of Bible records and things that she doesn't know what to do with. She's going to send them to us. We'll put them into a file. And then when people ask us about the Sudlers, which they will, we can refer them to filing case A, and, we can't vouch for the accuracy of what's in there. All we can do is put it into the file. But in a lot of cases, it will give you at least a clue to what you're looking for. And sometimes it actually comes right out and answers your question. So, it's worthwhile looking at our filing case A too. Yeah.
And to help contextualize everyone, what you see in this particular slide, the gray boxes are an example of what filing case A looks like. We have a separate room in our library that features these boxes, close to 200 boxes of these genealogical resources that I've outlined on the slide here, with family Bible records, newspaper clippings, research notes. Sometimes you'll find family trees in there. And like Mr. O'Neill said, in a lot of cases, you will find, if not a clue to your genealogical questions, you might find your answers outright there. He's discussed the Dillman Hayward file. That's that file of newspaper clippings. and then our genealogy indexes.
Okay, the genealogy indexes, sometimes when members or even just people in the general public give us materials, it's not small enough to fit into one of those gray boxes that you just saw. It can be, 6 or 8 cartons of materials, research notes that they've put together through their whole lives. They always intended to publish it. They never got around to it. Sometimes they're still alive when they give it to us. Sometimes it's their heirs who pass it along to us. So we have a basement that's basically full of genealogy collections, all arranged by families. And these drawers with the yellow tags that you can see in this picture are the index to that. So, it may be that we would have 12 boxes of materials on the Enloe family, which I'm pretty sure we do. And that these cards would point you towards that, and we would bring them up for you to look at when you were here. Now, almost all of this material that we've been talking about in the last 5 minutes or so has not been digitized. It is not online. You will not be able to see it from Reno. You're going to have to pay us a visit, unfortunately. One of these days, long after I'm gone, all that stuff will be digitized and online. But at the moment, you're going to probably have to pay a visit to Baltimore. And while you're here, you're going to want to go down to Annapolis and see all the wills and deeds and that sort of thing that are in the Maryland State Archives. So to do Maryland genealogy, it gets easier all the time. The Maryland State Archives is digitizing a lot of their stuff. They have the money and we don't. But, at this point, it's still pretty wise to plan on paying a visit to Maryland if you have any quantity of Maryland ancestors that you're looking into.
Okay. And just to clarify, the Pisano O'Neill file is the one exception to what Mr. O'Neill said. Those cards that he has been working on, the last half of that title actually is his name, because he's been working on this particular collection of information for the past 44 years. This is the one exception to that rule. It is digitized, and you can access it from Reno or elsewhere internationally by visiting our website. If you were to visit our website, mdhistory.org, here is that pathway that you can use to access it. And my best recommendation is that once you follow that pathway by going to the main page and then online resources, which I'll talk about, and then finding aids, type in, using quotation marks, either the word Passano, P-A-S-S-A-N-O, or O'Neill, the hyphen N-E-I-L-L, and that will give you the Pisano O'Neill file, which is, as the previous tab mentioned, 65,000 plus cards that Mr. O'Neill has typed up over his 44 years of working on the file, and it will be information block by block, street address by street address of different houses, buildings, structures, and what have you here in Maryland. Mostly Baltimore City centric, but we do have cards on every single county in Maryland. As he mentioned, like any other library that services the public, we do have access to sort of general resources. Those include access to our local papers, the Baltimore Sun and the Afro, through the Enoch Pratt Free Library. And that also includes access to Heritage Quest and, of course, all of the wealth of information that comes through their city directories, a lot of which we have either physically or also on microfiche or microfilm, as well as the federal census records, which are up to 1950, if I'm not mistaken, now 1790 through 1950. And of course, we have a wide range of microfilm as well that you may not be able to access elsewhere. And then we move on to special collections. This is my department. I like to make the differentiation between main reading room and special collections, as main reading room are resources that you can typically find at your local public library or a college or university library, things that are already published and out in the public for people to access. Special collections resources are going to be a lot more unique. You may find some rare things, that are copies of these original records, but in a lot of cases, what we have in my department are unique to our organization, unique to our repository. And perhaps my favorite resources among those are Revolutionary War resources. So as Mr. O'Neill said, our organization started as a group of men with connections to the Revolutionary War. With that being said, we have a very large collection of military records from the Revolutionary War, and I have a call number here on the screen for you, MS 1146. That particular collection features enlistment records, muster rolls, pay records, some court martials, things along those lines, so that if you have a Revolutionary War ancestor who you believe served in Maryland during the war, there's a very strong chance that we can find information for that person. In particular, if you are applying for a lineage society such as the DAR or the SAR, a lot of our clientele are those kinds of people who are looking into these hereditary organizations. The other collection that most people inquire about who are conducting Revolutionary War research is MS 3088, our Oaths of Allegiance and Oaths of Fidelity collection. Again, if you're applying to an organization like the DAR or the SAR, a lot of times they're going to want to see proof with original documentation that your ancestor either took an oath, meaning that they were patriotic towards the cause, or that they served actual military service. There is a distinction between those two documents, an oath of fidelity and a military document, but we can attack your genealogical questions from either angle using our Revolutionary War resources. Our Oaths of Fidelity and our Revolutionary War military records are digitized, and we're in the process of making them publicly available for researchers who are not just in Maryland, but of course, across the country. Of course, we have a fairly large collection of documents that pertain to enslavement as well as emancipation, and they're sort of spread out amongst different collections along the larger special collections banner. We have a decent collection of runaway slave ads. Those fall under our broadsides collection. In the right-hand side, you see an example of a manumission of an African-American man who serves in the Civil War. And at the very top is one of many examples that we have of enslaved persons who are being recorded within the personal papers, the personal collection of someone who's donated material from their family. I chose this particular image because if you can see it clearly enough in the left-hand column, the very first name, Ben, that is the name of Harriet Tubman's father. That's why I chose that particular slide. So in a lot of cases, we will have donors who donate this material either because their family no longer wants them, needs them, or they want them to go to a home that can properly take care of them. We can conserve documents and preserve them on an as-needed basis. Of course, digitizing is part of that process. And while we're going through these materials, while our archivists are going through the materials in particular, we make discoveries like these, and then we try to make it our process, our goal of making them publicly available through our digital collections portal, which I'll get into. One of our other special collections resources that we have, and I want to add the caveat, this is really just a snapshot of some of the things that we have, are our funeral home records. These are pretty unique. These particular records that you can see, these very large, voluminous documents here are from the Tickner Funeral Home, who kept meticulous, very highly detailed records for the greater course of 100 plus years. This particular image here features a name. It will give you a death date, relations, age, cause of death, birthplace, and at the bottom of the page, it will even outline what sort of casket the person was buried in, if they had gloves, how many chairs were rented for the funeral, that kind of thing. So very, very detailed records. If you have an idea that a family member of yours from Maryland was funeralized through the Tickner Funeral Home services, there's a very strong chance that we have an exact page from one of these many volumes documenting their passing as well as their funeral service. Which then moves us on to online resources. Now, excitingly, these are resources that our friends in Reno can access from where you are. You don't have to visit us in person. Of course, we absolutely enjoy that. And to access these, all you need to do is just visit our website at mdhistory.org. And then, as I have outlined in the picture here, just click on online resources. That will take you to this page. And then from there, you can start accessing all the resources that we have available to you remotely. And the very first resource that I like to mention to patrons, whether you are local or not, is our library catalog. You'll follow that pathway that I have outlined on the page, our main page, again, mdhistory.org. You'll click on online resources and then our library catalog. From there, if you have a topic that you're interested in, it doesn't just have to be genealogy. You can type that into the search bar there, and then amongst the 7 million items that we have and counting, you will find resources that cater towards that, both from Mr. O'Neill's department, which is main reading room resources, and special collections, which is my department. Alternatively, if you are looking solely for primary resources, special collections, you'll want to focus on the Finding Aids database, and we'll follow that exact same pathway. Instead of clicking on the library catalog, once you're in the online resources page, you'll click on Finding Aids, and then from here, you can type in, again, any search term that you have. If you have an individual person that you're researching, you can enter it into the search bar. Alternatively, if you have a family that you're researching, you can repeat that process. I always recommend using quotation marks. That will give you the best results that we have. It'll sort of filter everything. And that will also yield, I should say, manuscripts that will yield ephemera, photographs, those kinds of things. Again, that all falls under the banner of special collections. And then our research guides. We have research guides covering a wide range of topics. Now, for our purposes, we're interested primarily in genealogy today. So I have a snapshot of the very first page of the genealogical guide that we have. You can access these guides, again, remotely. You'll go to online resources as we've done already. You'll scroll down the page. You'll see research guides. You'll click on that. And depending on your specific topic, if you're researching architecture, you'll click on the architecture guide. If you're researching genealogy and you want to know what sort of resources that we have, that guide will expand on what we've talked about, and you'll be able to read it at your leisure. And you can repeat that process for many of the other topics that I have outlined here. I'm in the process of working on an Indigenous research guide, which has not been published just yet. We're in the process of editing it, but that will be added to this page as well. And again, our collections are growing. Over time, we'll go back and edit these guides so that they are up to date with the newest resources that we've acquired. And then digital collections. If you aren't the sort of researcher who likes to look through pages and pages of text, if you are a visual researcher, a visual learner, you can visit our digital collections page. When Mr. O'Neill and I last conducted this particular presentation, we had 2,041 items digitized across our museum department, who oversees 3D objects, think weapons, clothing, jewelry, etc., and our library department. We typically oversee printed material, and you can see that item there, that item count there. As of now, to date, we have just over or just under 1,000 new items. So we tend to digitize things on an as-needed basis. When there's an exhibition going on in our museum department, when paintings are being brought up, they'll want to contextualize them with material from our library. Our library staff, Mr. O'Neill and I included, will provide that information and in some cases that material to our museum. They'll get that stuff digitized, and then it makes its way onto digital collections. That way, folks such as yourselves can access them remotely. And then if you have questions, you can inquire about them through our website. And this brings us to the end of the presentation. We hope we haven't gone too long. Of course, if you are planning to physically visit our library, you'll want to make note of several things. One, our library hours, that's most important. We're open to the public Wednesday through Friday, 10 to 5, and the second Saturday of each month, 10 to 5 as well. If you are intending on conducting primary research, if you're looking for manuscripts and photographs and ephemera, you'll need to schedule an appointment. That can be done through our website as well, and that's by appointment. Once that appointment form gets submitted, that will go to myself and one of our archivists, who will then confirm the appointment. Alternatively, if you are a bit confused by the process and you would just like to ask questions, you can call our number that's posted right there, extension 359. That will go directly to our library. And you can also email us at specialcollections@mdhistory.org. That will go to everyone in the library, and we can pass it along to Mr. O'Neill as well, who has a slightly separate library email address. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. Again, we hope that you have found the information beneficial, and we thank you for your time. Ms. Malik, if there are any questions, we are more than happy to receive them at this time.
Okay, I see that RD put in the chat box. Let's see, she wants to know, or he wants to know, where did the George Meany archive collections go to, or under the care of who has the care of them now? He or she is a graduate from the National Labor College in Silver Springs, Maryland, where the archives used to sit. As they held all of the labor records for the unions, the college folded several years ago. Do you know the answer to that?
You said the George R.
The George Meany.
George
The
Meany,
George Meany.
MEANY, George Meany Archives. Used to
I
be at
don't
the
know.
National Labor College.
I don't know that answer off the top of my head. If I had time to go through our catalog, I could see if we still, excuse me, Mr. O'Neill, if we still maintain that collection or not. And if we don't, then I'd be more than happy to share the repository that holds that material.
Yeah, I would call the AFL-CIO headquarters in Washington. They're bound to know where they are now. It's not anything that we ever really had any contact with, but the AFL-CIO would know where it is.
Wonderful. Okay. I'll open the floor to the class. If you have a question, please unmute your microphone.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yes.
First, I would like to ask you gentlemen if you're familiar with the name Benjamin Oden.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I've been researching the Oden family for 30 years, and I have documents that I'm trying to find that I haven't been able to find. And I have documents which, if I'm not mistaken, because the last time I checked with the Historical Society, they didn't know who Benjamin Oden's parents were. But I have original source documents, although they're circumstantial, that I think pretty well prove who his parents were. And the documents that I'm looking for are Benjamin Oden sold his land in western Prince George's County, I think it was, to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson to form Washington City in about 1792 or so, when they did that. And I have tried to find that deed. I called the Prince George's County, that their records show that the deed was transferred to Washington. I've called the Washington DC archives. I suggested that they look in the beginning of the deed book, because I would think, since it's one of the properties that formed the city, it would be there, because I didn't have an exact date on it. They couldn't find it. I also called the Washington DC archives, and they can't find it. And I can tell you where the property is, because there's a map in the Library of Congress that shows the property belonging to B. Oden. And if you look at the White House, there was one piece of property just north of the White House and then the second piece of property just north of that is the property that Benjamin Oden sold them. And I'd like to have the deed. And then the other thing is, once I'm ready to publish who his parents were, are you the best place to send the information, in addition to, I plan to put it on Family Search?
I can do this one, Mike.
Okay.
Okay, you got a lot of questions there. Let me see if I can take them one at a time. Normally, when the District of Columbia was founded, it's not that the federal government bought your property unless they were going to put a building on it themselves. I mean, it would remain your property and you could sell it to whoever you wanted. It was just no longer in Prince George's County. It was now in the District of Columbia. So it may be that you see Benjamin Odin selling it to another person rather than the federal government. And that may be the best way to look for it. Now, there is a historical society in the District of Columbia, which has changed its name, unfortunately, the way so many of them have. It's now called Washington History, I think it is. So if you put that into Google, it will tell you how to get in touch with their historical society, which probably knows a lot more about land transfers in the District of Columbia in the early days than anybody else does. Or if they don't know it themselves, they'll know who to put you in touch with. So that's what I would do for that. Now I've forgotten the second part of your question, but
What's about his parentage?
oh, okay, and his parentage. The best place that we know to publish material like that, if that's what you're thinking of doing, is the Maryland Genealogical Society, which is here in the building with us. They have their own journal, which deals with nothing but local genealogical matters. So put Maryland Genealogical Society in, and you'll see that they're always soliciting articles to go into their magazine. And, they have 4,000 or 5,000 members, I think it is. And, they're very active, and they go to all of the libraries, in the Middle Atlantic states. So, if you wanted to get it out there, apart from putting it online, that's probably the best way to do it, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
According to the information I've gotten from the Library of Congress, there were 23 people originally who did deed their property to the federal government. Then that was to form Washington City. That had nothing to do with Washington, D.C. And there is apparently a deed where Benjamin Odin did that. It was at one time in the Prince George's County deed records, but their notation says that it was sent off to Washington. And so I will contact the Washington Historical Society, but I was hoping that since Benjamin Odin was a citizen of Maryland, that you might have some information on it. He was the grandfather of Odin Bowie, who was, I think, the 24th governor.
Right. And so I founded Odenton here in Maryland, that kind of thing. Yeah, we have a lot of people where that kind of thing comes up. Charles Carroll had cousins, Charles Carroll of Carrollton had cousins, Charles Carroll of Duddington and that kind of thing, who were in the same situation where they were, at one minute, they were citizens of Prince George's County, and the next minute they found their property was all in the District of Columbia. They may have sold some of it to the federal government. As I say, you can't build the U.S. Capitol on privately owned land, even in those days.
No.
They would have sold, parts of it to the federal government, but there would have been other parts that they would have sold to private purchasers, and that kind of thing. But
I know that part of that property went to Benjamin Odin's daughter, who I believe was married to a West. That's from his will. But the way the terms of that went, the major portion of the property was to be turned over to the federal government, and each seller was allowed to keep X number of acres where they could continue to live. And I think that X number of acres is the property that Odin left to his daughter, who married West. So, all right, I will call the Washington History about that, because I think it would be important to, that seems to be one of his most remarkable achievements, aside from being extremely wealthy and friends with Francis Scott Key.
But yeah, as I say, we're not really the best people for land transfers. You know, the
Okay.
Maryland State Archives would probably be more useful to you, and, you know, all these government agencies in Washington, some of whom you've already talked to, you know, would know more about the transfers than we will. Because
Yeah.
we're a private organization, you know, and they are the ones who deal with government documents like deeds.
Okay.
And
I've done extensive research in the Maryland archives in past years, and most of the information that I got from there,
Mhm.
except one of my cousins, my Odin cousins, happened to stumble over this business about Washington City. The other thing is I manage the Odin surname DNA project at Family Tree DNA and have done for about 15 years. And we have conclusively identified the immigrant ancestor to this family and are happy with our results. I just am trying to get Benjamin sorted out.
Yeah.
certainly, what I would recommend you do is that either in the course of following up with the recommendations that Mr. O'Neill shared, if you are still curious about our holdings, if you feel comfortable enough, by all means, visit our website and sort of play around with our catalog. Alternatively, the slide that I have posted here has our special collections email address. Feel free to email us and inquire if we have any manuscript material from Odin. And I think that we do, either physically or on microfilm. Myself and the rest of our special collection staff can look into that on your behalf to a certain extent, to see what we have. There may be a finding aid that sort of outlines the kind of material that's within the collection. We're absolutely happy to do that for you if you'd like.
My understanding was that whatever Odin papers were existing had been given to, I thought it was the Historical Society. It might have been the genealogical, I don't know. But my understanding is his papers is in one of those places. And I
We-
thought that since you took over the Historical Society, I guess it is,
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
maybe,
we were formerly the Maryland Historical Society. So if his papers were donated to us, and I just don't know off the top of my head because I don't have the catalog directly in front of me, we just rebranded in 2019, 2020, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
we're currently Maryland Center for History and Culture, but all of the material maintained by the Maryland Historical Society are still maintained by us. We're the same organization with a different name and different branding.
yeah, I
if
got
makes
that.
sense. Yeah. So
So
in
I
theory,
thought maybe you would have his papers.
like I said, it's very possible that we do, and I think we do. I just can't confirm that because I don't have the catalog in front of me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Mhm.
I thank you for this Washington History Society, and if they don't know what I'm talking about or can't find it, I'll come back and ask you again.
But
Okay,
by all
good,
means, you
good.
have the email address in front of you. Feel free to jot it down or copy it. Feel free to send us an email. Like I said, we're happy to look into the papers on your behalf.
Yeah, I have no problem with the
Mhm.
the internet, so I'll be able to do it. Thank you.
Certainly. You're very
welcome.
welcome.
Well, that kind of brings me to a question I'm sure that everyone's thinking about. If you need reference, if you live here in Reno, or I mean, we get people from all over the country logging into my class every week. We get people from Florida, Wisconsin, New Mexico. If
Mhm.
anybody wanted to contact you to find out, need some reference assistance, can they do it through your regular email address that you have displayed?
Yes, absolutely. Any questions that anyone has, let's say you are inquiring about general resources or genealogical resources, since that's the topic of our discussion today, feel free to jot down the special collections at mdhistory.org email. Like I said, Mr. O'Neill technically has a separate email, but myself and the rest of our library staff will see it, and then we can filter and pass those on to Mr. O'Neill as needed. Alternatively, if you want to talk to one of us, feel free to contact us using that phone number that I have posted in front of us. That 3750 extension 359 will get you to the library department. Typically, Mr. O'Neill and I answer the phone, so between the two of us, we will hopefully be able to talk with you. And if not answer your question using the resources here, then recommend the next best repository to talk to.
Yeah, we're hoping to hear from a lot of Nevadans after this.
Hopefully so.
That'd be great. I do, before I open the floor to the rest of the class, I do have another question. You had mentioned that you mainly deal with genealogy and the history of houses there in Maryland,
Mhm.
as your typical questions. But can
Mhm.
you give our class, like, just what is a typical genealogy question that you get asked, and what steps would you take to answer that question?
That's a very good question. It really depends on the level of genealogical research you've conducted prior to visiting us. So, we will have a patron who comes in who knows the name of, say, their great great grandfather who served in the Revolutionary War. This is the kind of question I typically deal with. I can typically go through our secondary resources. I like to start at the secondary level. I look at the citations that are hopefully in the books, and then work my way backwards through our secondary resources into the primary resources. For example, if you've conducted DAR research into a Revolutionary War patron or Revolutionary War patriot, excuse me, you may be familiar with Henry C. Peden Jr.'s works. He covers every single county in Maryland and the Revolutionary patriots that were produced from those counties. Within his books, he gives very strong citations for the resources that he looked at. I will go to Mr. Peden's books, then work my way through his resources. And then once I know a name of the Patriot, as well as a unit that the Patriot served with, if they served military service, as opposed to just taking an oath, then I can go into MS 1146, our collection of physical, original military records, and then produce a photocopy or scanned photocopy for that patron to look at. In Mr. O'Neill's case, we will typically get what we call walk-ins, people who have no appointments, which is fine, who will come in and inquire, I'm trying to find information on my grandmother who lived on such and such street here in Baltimore. Do you have any information on them? Mr. O'Neill will go through the Dealman file, which we discussed already, coupled with the city directories, and he maintains a wider range of those. In addition to the federal census records, again, we're up to 1950 at this point, and the newspaper records that we have available to paint as wide a picture of that person and their life as we can. And obviously, most people are interested in the living conditions of that person, the buildings that they were living in, the house, the street address. And since Mr. O'Neill maintains that file, he will typically couple all that material with that. But we can go further back to some extent with certain people. It just really depends on the record. Really.
Yeah, with genealogy questions, it's really determined by when and where are you asking about. I mean, there are very few private papers that exist from the 17th century. All of the stuff that survives from the 17th century is related to legal materials, and it's all going to be at the Maryland State Archives. The closer you get to modern times, the more likely we are to have stuff about the person you're looking for. And then the other thing is, how far away from Baltimore is your question? If you're asking about somebody in Worcester County, which is on the other side of Chesapeake Bay, and you're looking in the 18th century, there's probably not going to be a lot of material that has been donated to us. It would have gone to the NAB Center, it would have gone to the Maryland State Archives and that kind of thing. Whereas nowadays, if you're looking for somebody in Baltimore City, which is what Michael was just talking about, from the Civil War on, we can probably find it. But you want to remember that up until 1950, Baltimore consisted, the 2/3 of the population of Baltimore consisted of Maryland consisted of Baltimoreans. The rest of the state was only 1/3 of the population. Since then, the proportions have pretty much reversed. Everybody has moved out to the suburbs. Everybody is living in the Washington suburbs and that kind of stuff. So the state is totally different than it was in the 19th century. But, so it's all, who are you looking for and when are you looking for them and where were they?
Okay. Once again, I'll open it up to the class. Give it a few seconds. Okay, while we're waiting for any more questions to come in, Actually, this is a question for both of you.
Yes.
In your opinion, what is, in your own personal opinion, what is the most valuable genealogical resource you have there in your facility? And what is your favorite collection and why?
We'll tackle that one. Favorite.
Well, I mean, as I say, I mean, I do a lot of Baltimore questions. And I would say that the Baltimore Sun online is probably the thing that is the most helpful to me. That is our paper that was founded in 1837. Unfortunately, you folks in Nevada probably are not going to be able to go into that database because you have to have a library card from the Enoch Pratt Free Library, which is our public library here in Baltimore. That's the first thing they're going to ask you is what's your library card number? And if you don't have one, you won't be able to look at it. But for those of us who are lucky enough to be here and have library cards, we can look at every issue of the Baltimore Sun from 1837 up until last week, just about. And, most of the time, find what we're looking for in there. So that's what I would say for me.
I would venture to say it really depends. Because my interest is Revolutionary War history, I am biased towards MS 1146 and our Revolutionary War military records, but that's really just a subset of genealogical resources that we have. In general, I'm also inclined to say the Pisano file because we get so many patrons who are interested in knowing about structures and buildings and apartments and street addresses and what have you here in Maryland. Again, it's very Baltimore City centric, but I personally love the history behind the file itself. Again, I've mentioned it before, and I think it bears repeating. Mr. Neal has devoted the past 44 years of his time here in updating this file. I believe he said when he started working on the file, the cards were all handwritten and they were completely organized differently based on the names of the owners. Whereas now he's gone through the time to reorganize everything based on street addresses, which is just much more efficient when it comes to conducting this kind of research. And the fact that all these cards were digitized only several years ago makes it that much more valuable and accessible to the public. So on one hand, from the special collections perspective, I would argue Revolutionary War records are my favorite collection. But in terms of versatility and practicality, you can't get any better than the O'Neill file, in my opinion.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay, I'll open it once again to the floor of the class. Anybody have a question for our guest speakers? We'll give it a few more seconds. I do have a couple other questions.
Yes.
Micah, this is probably more addressed to you since it's involving special collections. I assume that that's based on those pictures you were showing that some of these are actually original source documents. If that is the case, are patrons allowed to handle this or can only you handle it?
That's a good question. In our library, we absolutely encourage patrons to work with, I was going to use the word manipulate, but that sounds like you're sort of playing with them, to work with our original source documentation. Now, in some cases, some very rare cases, material will be restricted to the public, but that's usually because something is considered very valuable. Let's say we have letters from every single president from Washington through Obama at this point. Those original source records are restricted to the public, but we have either Xeroxes or photocopies, facsimiles of those documents that are publicly available. But in the case of 1146, the slide that I have here, patrons can come in. If they schedule an appointment, they can work with those original documents. They can thumb through those just fine. In the case of the Oath of Fidelity, we have those completely digitized, so we don't tend to pull those physical items out. But a lot of our special collections material, we have, I think, close to 3,300 individual manuscript collections, and that's probably millions of pieces of paper just within those that patrons can come in and sort of look through without the fear of getting a very questionable eye from library staff. The only material that we have extra precautions for are things that have conservation needs. Of course, we're talking about documents from 300 plus years ago. So in some cases, they need to be handled very carefully, very patiently. In some cases, like Revolutionary War records, they've been conserved already, so that fear is a bit alleviated. When it comes to our photograph collections, we do ask patrons to wear gloves, and those are the only collections in our library that we ask patrons to do that with. And that's because of the oils in our hands. They're detrimental to photograph paper. And that's the same with our print photographs, case photographs, etc. That danger is not there with our paper material at all. And hopefully that answers that question.
Oh, yes, thank you. I'll open the floor one more time to the class. This will be our final opportunity to ask the guest speakers. Any
Certainly.
questions?
And no question is off limits. If you have any questions, we're happy to answer them to the best of our abilities.
Give it a few more seconds while we're waiting for one last opportunity. If you had to guesstimate, what percentage of your collection do you think is digitized?
It's a very small percentage. I can admit that. So we have over 7 million items. It may be close to 8 million, to be honest. Of that, at least 7 million items that we have, the 3,040 items that you see in digital collections on this page here, that is the exact count of things that have been digitized and are publicly available. There may be perhaps an additional 1,000 items that have been digitized. I don't know that exact number. I'm just sort of guesstimating here. So it's a very, very small fraction. And that, of course, is across both museum department and library department. Our museum staff have a completely separate catalog that is not accessible to the public, but patrons can still inquire about particular artworks, paintings, and that kind of thing. It's just not publicly available. So again, a very small fraction of our material has been digitized, but we're constantly in the process of digitizing things on an as needs basis, as well as on a conservation/preservation needs basis as well.
Yeah, it's because we're poor. We're not a government agency. We don't get any money from the government. So when it comes to digitizing stuff, we have to pay for it ourselves, and we don't have the money most of the time. So,
well, that kind of brings me, as a librarian, I kind of ask this question frequently of our guest speakers. I assume that you write grants for some of your funding, but where does the rest of your funding come from?
Oh, well, those are good questions. A lot of our material, speaking from a special collections perspective, gets donated by the public. In some cases, we will purchase things via auction, but in a lot of cases, it's patrons who are just donating material that, again, their families don't deem that they need anymore, that kind of thing. In terms of larger scale funding, though, I would probably direct that question to our advancement department, to be honest. They can answer that question a lot better than we can. But we do our fair share of grant writing and applying for these sorts of gifts as well.
yeah, grants are always aimed at specific projects, so you can get a grant to do A and B and that kind of thing, but you can't get it to, pay the light bill or the staff salary and that kind of thing. We do have an endowment, which we have collected in the course of our 180 years of existence. And most of the time, I think that's where the money for paying the light bill and paying the staff comes from. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. All right. Well, just a few more seconds here. Class, one last opportunity. Okay. Well, it sounds like all the questions have been answered. So I want to thank you both very, very much for a wonderful presentation and a wealth of knowledge that we hopefully will all be able to use. And before I say goodbye, I want to let everyone know that you're welcome to stay for the second half of class. We do have several more hours ahead where we call the open lab portion of class, where we all work together on our family trees. And if you will be leaving us at this point in time, if there's anything in the chat box that you want, please download it before you sign out, because if you forget and sign back in, the chat box will be empty. So with that, I'll say thank you very, very much to both Micah and Francis, and just wonderful opportunity. And we are so thankful that you were able to take time out of your day today to to help enlighten us with more knowledge.
For having us.
Thank you for having us. We greatly appreciate it.